Lecture 21, Xenophon, Plato, and Philip.
In our last lecture, we examined the trial and execution of Socrates. To the Athenian jury which convicted him, he was guilty of blasphemy and of corrupting the young. To his pupils, like Plato and Xenophon, he was the best, the wisest, and most just man of his day. His legacy was one of example and of ideas. The example of his life, the philosopher, the searcher after wisdom, whose very death was a testimony to his search for the truth. His ideas lived on through his pupils, and the very fact that the Athenian democracy had put him to death discredited it in the eyes of his pupils and the entire legacy of their philosophical tradition. For Xenophon, the death of Socrates in this fashion was such a trauma that he left Athens. He would take service as a soldier in the army of the Persian king Cyrus and leave us the most memorable account of that prince's attempt to overthrow his brother and then of the march back of the 10,000 Greek soldiers. He would live on at Sparta, serving under King Agesilaus of Sparta, writing a wonderful book on the constitution of the Spartans, and disassociating himself from Athens in its entirety. And for Xenophon, the best form of government was monarchy. And he wrote a panegyric on the life of Cyrus, the founder of the Persian Empire, the Cyropaedia, the education of Cyrus. Plato was equally sure in his rejection of the Athenian democracy. It was to him a perverted form of government. He would make 3 trips to Sicily in a futile attempt to educate a philosopher-king in the form of Dionysius II, the tyrant of Syracuse. But his entire life would reflect the influence of his teacher Socrates and the idea that the best form of government ultimately is a philosopher-king, the rule of a single, good, virtuous man. And this is the legacy he would pass on to Aristotle. And Aristotle would put this into effect by becoming the tutor to the son of the king of Macedonia, King Philip's son, Alexander. And the rise of monarchy, both as an idea and as a reality in the 4th century BC, is the most important single fact of that era. For the city-state would cease to be the dominant political unit, and for the next 1,600 years of European history, monarchy would dominate the world. Now, the politicians of Athens did not grasp this. They, like the politicians in cities like Thebes and Corinth, thought that the Greek world would go along in its same old fashion. They did not understand the new forces which were arising, new forces brought into being by the Peloponnesian War and the trauma of that great world war. It was a catastrophic war, as forceful in its impact upon Greece of the 4th century as the First World War was upon the 20th century. Probably more than 1 out of every 4 Athenians would die in that war, perhaps 1 out of every 2 Spartans. And the psychological effect was even greater. For men and women questioned whether any sacrifice so great could be worth it. Why must one die for one's country became the question. Even as after the First World War, students at Oxford would take a vow never to die for king or country. And yet the politicians continued to play the old games of power and failed to notice, as the Athenians recreated their empire, as Sparta made its effort to liberate the cities of Asia Minor, as Corinth and Thebes both made their efforts to become the dominant power in Greece, these all failed to notice the rise on their frontiers of a new power that would change forever the history of Greece, the power of Macedonia. And to the creator of that kingdom, as it came to exist, to Philip, king of Macedonia, we will turn in this lecture. Macedonia has come from time to time into the view of our lectures. We met a king of Macedonia named Alexander, coming to Athens right after the Battle of Salamis, coming as an ambassador from King Xerxes and offering an alliance to the Athenians. But on the whole, it had stayed a minor power, despite the fact that in terms of size, it was far larger than any Greek city-state. It has considerable natural resources and a large population of sturdy peasants, suitable to be turned into the kind of soldiers that the Athenians and Spartans had been in the heyday of the Greek hoplite. But the natural resources of Macedonia had not compensated for the fact that it was a disunited country at a fairly backward level of civilization as compared with the Greek city-states. It was still a monarchy and arranged somewhat along tribal lines. What cities existed inside Macedonia were Greek. It was also surrounded by predatory neighbors, Illyrians, Paeonians, Thracians, peoples the Greeks called barbarians, who again and again raided the territory of Macedonia. It was also a pawn in the larger politics, particularly of Athens, which always had strong interest in Macedonia because of its closeness to the Black Sea, that central source of grain for the Athenians. And in 359, Macedonia went through one of its periodic disasters. Its king was killed on the field of battle during an attack by the Illyrians. And in the ensuing weeks, not only Illyrians but Paeonians poured into the country. And the Athenians began a march upon the capital city of Macedonia, upon Pella, to install their own pretender upon the throne. But the shattered army of Macedonia, in retreat, rallied and called an assembly. For the Macedonian army was the nation of Macedonia. It was the people in arms. And it always carried with them, if not the king himself, then the child of the king. And it had with him the little baby son of the king who had died in battle. And also there, the uncle of the king, Philip. And the Macedonians hailed out the little baby as their new king, but chose Philip to be their regent. And in the next few months, Philip, in his early 20s, began to transform the Macedonian army. He had been kept as a hostage in Thebes, studied military science under some of the leading Greek generals of the day, and returned to Macedonia, not only with a vision of a new kind of army, but with a vision of making Macedonia the greatest nation in the Greek world, and himself the master of the Greek world. So historians too often look upon great figures like Philip or Julius Caesar as simple opportunists who go from one chance to the other. It's not true. Great leaders have a vision, and for Philip, this vision motivated every move he would make for the rest of his life. He first transformed the army by changing its equipment. The Macedonians had fought sort of as Greek hoplites up until this time. He now gave to the Macedonians a 16-foot spear. Historians long doubted that anyone could handle a 16-foot spear, but the archaeological evidence has now established that this is what they carried. A round shield with it, which hung by a strap, leaving both arms free to handle this massive spear. A slashing sword of about 3 feet long, and lighter equipment than the Greek hoplite wore. A chainmail breastplate that gave greater mobility to the Macedonian infantrymen. And then bringing this all together, a transformation in the phalanx formation, so that the Macedonians went into battle not 8 men deep, but 16 men deep. And with these long 16-foot spears, some 5 spear points stuck out at the opposing infantry line. And then the cavalry was transformed. Greeks had never made proper use of heavy armed cavalry. Philip changed this. The Macedonian cavalryman wore a heavy breastplate, greaves, carried an 8-foot long spear made of especially hardened wood, and then another slashing sword. And infantry and cavalry over this single winter were trained to operate as one instrument, so that the infantry could charge into battle holding on to the tail of the horse, and cavalrymen and infantrymen achieving a tremendous impact as they swept into the foe. And it was with this reformed army that Philip, when the spring came around, would meet again the Illyrians in battle and destroy them, drive them out of Macedonia, turning then upon the Paeonians, the other barbarous nation, and routing their forces. And then, having shown himself a master of war, then showed himself to be a master of diplomacy, and played the Athenians off, appealing to the Athenian spirit of the 4th century, which was one of, let's not fight if we don't have to, one that enjoyed using mercenary troops rather than citizen soldiers, and in which the citizen most wanted a surplus in the budget so he could get a tax rebate. Fighting wars was expensive, and so Philip promised that he would deliver cities to Athens if they left him in peace. He captured the cities right enough, but maintained them for himself. And by 356, he was master of the city of Amphipolis with its gold mines, which would give him an annual income of 1,000 talents a year, more than any other Greek city-state had. And he had created a national professional army, an army of professional soldiers, but imbued with a national patriotism, a love of Macedonia, and a devotion to their king. And he began to expand his borders eastward into Thrace. And by the year 356, not only did he gain mastery over a significant portion of Thrace, but his chariots won in the Olympic Games, recognition that he was a Greek. To the Greeks as a whole, the Macedonians had never really counted as Hellenes, but now Philip was reckoned as part of this great race. And that same day that he learned about a victory over the Thracians, that his chariots had won, he also learned that he had become the father of a son by his wife Olympias. His very marriage to her was a diplomatic act to secure the rear entrance into Macedonia, the land of Epirus, and she was the sister of the king of Epirus. And so by diplomacy and warfare, Philip secured the existence of Macedonia, which only 3 years before had been in danger. Then in the next 10 years, he transforms Macedonia into a power within the Greek world, making use of military methods when he must, diplomacy when he can. He uses his gold to buy supporters in every city of Greece, in Athens, in Corinth, in Thebes. He gains the support of the people of Thessaly and is chosen as their archon, to use their ancient name, their tagus, leader of the League of Thessalian cities. And with that acquisition, he also gains the finest cavalry among the Greeks. And so by 346, Macedonia, under the guidance of Philip, has become a major power. And yet, the Athenians remain complacent. To them, he is still, let him win at the Olympic Games. He is still a barbarian. Macedonia in the past has had from time to time vigorous kings. They always get assassinated or die on the field of battle. And the Athenians want to go along in their quiet way, using their mercenary forces when they have to, above all, wanting politicians who can balance the budget. The one figure in Athens who speaks out again and again about the danger of Philip is Demosthenes, the greatest orator of his day, and a statesman who would have been at home in the Athens of Pericles when the Athenians dreamt that vision of being number one. His father had died when Demosthenes was young and left a certain estate, but when Demosthenes grew up, that estate had vanished. His guardians had really squandered it, and he tried to get it back and failed, and so he decided that he would become an orator. In the first place, to try to gain back this estate of his father. He didn't have a powerful speaking voice, and he used to go down to the seashore and put pebbles in his mouth and speak out against the roar of the waves. He would lock himself up in a room with just a mirror and practice those gestures which were so critical to the speaker's art in Athens. And he became a master of oratory. As powerful as Pericles, as persuasive as Alcibiades. And like Pericles, he had a vision. And that vision was that Athens would be still the center of freedom in the Greek world, and that Athens would lead Greece as its model. And the great threat to the freedom of Athens, the great threat to its democracy, was Philip. You do not begin to understand the cunning of this man. He is no barbarian. He is the most reflective statesman the Greek world has yet seen. And he has a goal. And it is not simple plunder, aggrandizement. It is mastery of our world. But you know, the reason why we have Philip is you, the Athenians. And if Philip were to die today, you would resurrect a new one by your apathy. But he could not persuade the Athenians of the danger of Philip, and so the Athenians would make a peace treaty. And it was one in which Philip essentially guaranteed the Athenians their position and power in the Black Sea, and with it, so critical, their grain supply. Athens could not feed itself. That grain supply was absolutely essential. But for Philip, this was but a breathing space to prepare himself for the final conflict with the Athenians, to bring him to that goal of absolute mastery. And so, starting in 341, he found occasions to break that treaty with the Athenians. Attacks upon cities like Perinthus and Byzantium in the Black Sea area, until by 338, Athens was forced to declare war. It was a declaration of war that came too late. But in this moment of crisis, Demosthenes rallied the Athenians. Once again, as at the time of Marathon, they raised a citizen army. They made an alliance with Thebes and brought together other Greek city-states to resist Philip. Philip moved rapidly, and by August of 338 had penetrated into the very heartland of Greece itself. And at this little city of Chaeronea, not so very far from Thebes, the army of Macedonia and the army of the allied Greeks under Athens came together. Both had about 30,000 men on their side. Philip's Macedonians fighting in their new formation, the Athenians and Thebans, the Corinthians and their other allies, not the Spartans. The Spartans do not participate, but the allied Greek force fighting as hoplites. And Alexander, the 18-year-old son of Philip, commanded the left wing of his father's army, commanded the cavalry. Such was Philip's faith in his son, already battle-tested. As the battle began, the Athenians, on their left wing, began to drive back the right wing of the Macedonians, where Philip was. And the right wing of the Macedonians began to give ground rapidly, being pushed back up a hill. And so excited were the Athenians that they shouted, "On to Macedonia!" And Demosthenes was fighting right there in the center of the Athenian line as an ordinary hoplite. But just as the top of the hill was reached, suddenly the Macedonian line stiffened. And without a signal from his father, simply knowing by intuition when to strike, Alexander led the Macedonian cavalry into the right wing of the allied troops, striking at the crack forces of the Thebans, the sacred band. 350 pairs of close friends sworn to fight, conquer, and die, if need be. And the Macedonian cavalry in wedge-shaped formation rode them down. And on the far wing, Philip's Macedonians turned and came back down that slope of the hill. those 5 spear points reaching out, driving into the Athenians, sweeping them from the field of battle. And when the day was done, the victory was total. A stone lion still rests today on the field at Chaeronea, marking the spot where the Theban sacred band died. It also marks the end of the Greek city-state. Philip never wanted the destruction of Athens. He wanted its recognition as hegemon, leader of the Greek world. And so he sent to the Athenians an ambassador and told the Athenians all he wanted was an alliance with them, that they would join him as his free, voluntary ally, retaining their own laws, retaining their position in Greece. Where have we heard a similar offer? Right after the Battle of Salamis, when the Persian king Xerxes made that offer to the Athenians. And what was their answer as they stood amidst their ruined city? As long as the sun moves in its course over the sky, we shall fight you. The men of Athens shall fight. But what did they say in 338? Not only did they accept the offer, they erected a statue to Philip. How do we explain this change? The Athenian dead who had fallen in the battle were escorted back under an honor guard, led not by Philip, that would be unseemly, inappropriate, but rather by his son Alexander. And the prisoners were all returned. And the Athenians, with the Corinthians, with the other cities of Greeks, except for the Spartans, joined together in a single great league and met together at the Isthmus of Corinth. How do we explain this change in Athens? I want to give you an old-fashioned answer. Simply moral fiber. They lacked the moral will, the will to power, that the men of Marathon and Salamis had. It was no longer worth the struggle for them. And so they became, the allies called it that, but the men of Marathon would have called it the slaves of Philip. And at Corinth in 338, this new league of the Greeks elected Philip as their commander-in-chief, joined itself into a perpetual alliance with Macedonia, and elected Philip as commander-in-chief of an expeditionary force to march against the Persian Empire, to take vengeance upon the Persians for the sacrileges ravaged upon Greece by Xerxes when he burned the temples and shrines of the gods, and to liberate the Greek cities of Asia Minor, which had fallen back under the control of the Persians. This was recognition of Macedonia as the leader of Greece and recognition of Philip as the greatest man in Greece. It was also an opportunity for the Greeks to fight side by side with Macedonians and to join together in greater solidarity, his new league of Greece. It was a vision that some of the finest minds of the age, men like Socrates of Athens, had, of Greeks not fighting against themselves in this perpetual internecine warfare, but together, one nation, the Hellenes, and opening up the entire East to colonization by the Greeks and relieving the pressure on land that was such a cause of civil war. By 336, elements of Philip's army were already landing in Persia. And Philip was planning by midsummer to lead the major portion of his army on this great crusade. His goal was limited: to liberate the Greek cities of Asia Minor, to deliver a smashing blow to the Persians, and to drive them back further into Asia, essentially to make what we would call Syria today, the dividing line between the world of Macedonia and its Greek allies and the land of the Persian king. But it was still a great plan. King Agesilaus of Sparta had failed to do it, and now Philip began the undertaking. But before he did that, he wanted to marry his daughter off. He had chosen to be her new husband, her uncle, the king of Epirus. And the occasion of this wedding in June of 336 was to bring the whole of the Greek world in the form of its ambassadors to his great capital city at Pella, to show them the splendor of his court and how much of a Greek he was. And Pella is indeed a Greek city with magnificent mosaics, glorious Greek temples and tombs and Greek-style houses, and a Greek theater, which was where the wedding was going to be held. That morning there had been a magnificent procession in which statues of Philip had been carried alongside statues of the gods. And there were already places in Asia Minor, Greek cities, that were daring to offer up sacrifices to Philip as to a living God. And then the wedding festival, the theater filled with ambassadors from all over Greece. And then by Macedonian custom, the bridegroom standing along with the bride, waiting for Philip to come out and join them in marriage. Now, a Greek theater has a covered passageway by which you can enter into the orchestra. And Philip, as he started into that covered passageway, told his bodyguard, "Just wait, stand there. I am not going to go into my daughter's wedding surrounded by bodyguards, by security." I mean, the Greeks believed that a leader who had to go around surrounded by security men was a tyrant. He couldn't trust his own citizens not to assassinate him. And Philip said, "I am going to go out there and show them that I am king over a free people." But as he started down that passageway, out of the corner of his eye, he noted one member of his bodyguard standing there, a young man named Pausanias, an unhappy young man in recent weeks. He had attended a banquet held in typical Macedonian fashion a few weeks before the wedding day. The Macedonians drank a lot. In fact, the Greeks said Macedonians were drunk before the hors d'oeuvres were even laid out. And this had been, they'd gotten very, very drunk, and he had been raped by these Macedonian officers and then thrown out in the stables to be raped by the stable boys. And he was a member of Philip's guard, and he went to Philip, and you could approach the Macedonian king. Any Macedonian could. It was part of their free ways. And he told the king what had happened, and the king said, "Well, I'm outraged by this. Who were these officers?" "Well, sir, one of them was Attalus." "Attalus?" For Attalus was not only Philip's best general, but also his father-in-law. Philip had recently married Attalus's daughter, and Philip said, "Well, I mean, it's a bad thing they did to you, but you'll get over it. I tell you what, I'm going to give you a raise in pay and a promotion." And the boy insisted, "I want you to punish them for this outrage." Hubris is the technical legal name for it. "I want you to punish them." "No, I'm not going to do it. Now stop bothering me about it." And so every day as Pausanias would go into the bodyguard review, people would snicker at him. They began to eat upon his mind. And so he went to his old teacher, his professor. And this professor said, "What's bothering you, my son?" And he said, "This is what's happened to me." And the professor, spouting the way professors always do, "Do you know, my son, how you can become the most famous man in the world?" "No." "Kill the most famous man in the world. And then no one will ever think of you as Pausanias, who was outraged, but Pausanias, the killer of the tyrant." "Do you mean I only say that is how to become famous for a virtuous act?" And that is the Pausanias who stood there. And as Philip walked along the passageway, Pausanias leaped out, having hidden a Celtic dagger inside his cloak. And there, before the shocked multitude of Greek ambassadors, stabbed Philip to death. At the height of his power, still young, about to embark on this great crusade, suddenly he was struck dead. And just as the Athenians had said, this Macedonian king got himself killed just like every other Macedonian king. He lived only long enough for his son Alexander to rush to his side and died in the arms of Alexander. And then as the crowd milled around, Philip's most trusted generals took Alexander, took him to the royal palace, brought him out to the balcony and before the Macedonian troops shouted out, "Hail Alexander, King of Macedonia!" And the troops, in traditional Macedonian fashion, beat their shields with their spears. But every wise head among the Greek ambassadors knew that this boy could not hold together Macedonia, and that the dagger of the assassin had freed the Greeks again. Whether that is true or not, we will see in our next lecture.